Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this seminar. I am Jie. Before I start, I would like to thank the GLO team, Olena, Klaus, Francesco, and everyone else. Participating in this program has been an amazing experience for me, and I thank everyone for being part of it. Today, the project I'm going to present is one of the joint projects I've done with my GLO advisor, Francesco Pastore. So this project is titled Returns to Vocational Education in China. The motivation of this research comes from two conflicting facts. So on the one hand, there is a long-standing tradition of degrading vocational education students in China, but only bad students go to vocational schools. And it has long been an open secret that vocational graduates are paid less well than academic graduates in China. However, quantitative research evidence is scarce. And on the other hand, in the recent decade, the Chinese government has been encouraging vocational education and emphasizing on the importance of having technically adept workers. For example, in 2019, the State Council issued the National Vocational Education Reform Implementation Plan. When someone has a national implementation plan, that means it will be the policy focus for the next few years or even decade. So I wonder, given these two conflicting facts, whether we observe any changes or any differences, any patterns, dynamics in terms of returns to vocational education in China. And here are some more research context. This is a graphical representation of China's education system for those who are not familiar with the context. So from left to right, we see that's how a person progresses in the education system in China. One starts with compulsory education, which composes of primary school and lower secondary school. And then one takes high school entrance exam. Depending on how well they perform, they will enter either academic upper secondary school or vocational upper secondary school. So based on the recent statistics, about half go to academic upper secondary school and the remaining half go to vocational upper secondary school. So those in the academic track can take the college entrance exam after they complete the upper secondary education and enter university. And the tertiary education, depending on how well they perform again, they might end up in academic university or vocational college. For those who are in the vocational upper secondary track, they can only take the transitional exam and they may enter the vocational college or they may directly go to the job market. After the vocational students complete the vocational college, if they like, they can take another exam and then enter academic university, after which they can progress to postgraduate degrees or directly go to the job market. And on the next page, we see some more context regarding vocational education more specifically. So vocational education is school-based and earns a degree, whereas vocational training is work-based and does not earn a degree in China. And by requirement, practical training should be no less than 50% of the total credit hours of the vocational education degree. I know in some countries, like vocational education only covers some sectors of the economy, but in China, a total of 19 areas corresponding to 1,349 majors, which cover all sectors of the economy, are set by the Professional Catalog of Vocational Education issued by the Ministry of Education. In terms of curricula, individual curricula should be designed following the national guidelines. That was also a requirement by the official document. And the specific research questions we want to look at are as follows. First, evaluate returns to vocational education in China, including returns to vocational upper secondary education and returns to vocational college education. So that was to get a rough picture. And then secondly, we want to do some comparative analysis looking at returns to vocational education degrees and also returns to academic education degrees and compare the dynamics or the differences between these different types of degrees. And then lastly, we will do some subsample analysis because due to the lack of sufficient literature in this area, we believe it will be interesting to uncover any patterns that might show during our analysis. As for the hypothesis, if we look at the 3 research questions, we cannot really make any hypothesis regarding the first or the third question, because they are kind of open-ended, and we allow any kind of possibilities. So the hypotheses are mainly regarding the second research question, namely the comparative analysis. So we have the following 3 hypotheses. First one, returns to academic upper secondary education is lower than returns to vocational upper secondary education. And then second hypothesis, returns to academic university education is higher than returns to vocational university education. So the first hypothesis was based on the literature that I found in the international context, whereas the second hypothesis was based on literature internationally and also in China, and also based on my personal observations. So the third hypothesis is comparing vocational education degree at the university level and also return vocational education at the upper secondary level. So these the sign of the comparison is not determined, because if tertiary education in general is more valued than upper secondary education by employers, then returns to vocational university education will be higher than returns to vocational upper secondary education. But if in the vocational track, because vocational education is most often specifically targeted at a particular job, so if early entry into the job market outshines a university diploma, then returns to vocational university education may not necessarily be higher than returns to vocational upper secondary education. And before we look at the specific results, here is a summary of what we found regarding these 3 hypotheses. First one, we actually find conflicting evidence, both yes and no. So we are not certain. If we can obtain some comments from the audience, that would be very helpful. And the second hypothesis, undoubtedly, we found evidence supporting our second hypothesis, that is returns to academic university education is higher than returns to vocational university education. Regarding the third hypothesis, we actually find evidence that tertiary level education qualification is more valued than several years of job experience. So that means returns to vocational university education is greater than returns to vocational upper secondary education. Regarding the literature, so our literature review actually focused on 2 parallel parts. On the one hand, we focus on international literature who explore very similar topic. For example, those by Brunello and Rocco, they find that the difference between vocational and academic education is very substantial at the tertiary level, around 20% higher for vocational education. And the second part of our literature review was on papers that investigate similar topics in the context of China, and mainly those are done by authors, Chinese authors or Chinese co-authors. And the 2 papers listed here use the same data set I used, but they use the older version. So due to the time limitation, we won't go to the details of the literature. Now we look at the data set. The data set I use is Chinese General Social Survey from 2010 to 2017. So this 2017 data set is released November 2020. So very recent data set. And using this novel data set, hence, is also one of our contributions. And the main outcome variable we look at is hourly wages, the definition of treatment variables, because we look at different types of education, so we use categorical variables. And later, when we use instrumental variables and Luber Method and other more complicated models, econometric models, it becomes very inconvenient to use the categorical variables. So we sometimes switch to dummies. And I will explain that when we get there. The control variables are pretty standard. So we use gender, experience, parental education, marital status, party membership, ethnicity, hukou, occupation, sector. So this hukou is probably specific to China. It's a kind of registration system that affects your medical insurance, your schooling choices, a lot of many things. so it is an important factor. That's why we control for it. And I also provide the summary statistics, but apparently we don't have time to go through them, one by one. I guess the main thing we can see from here is that we have a sample size of more than 20,000 or close to 30,000. So pretty reasonable, although, not huge compared to the population in China. Regarding the estimating strategy, we stick with the baseline standard means range equation, and that was to make our results comparable to the literature. And then we use instrumental variable method and Luber method, trying to identify cultural relationship, address endogeneity. Well, we will see what we achieved. Probably not so ideal, and we all understand the challenges faced in this area if we want to identify things correctly. But we decided to still present the results anyway, to inspire future researchers in case they wanted to try the same method or same instruments, right? Yeah. Here we see the VirtYS results. Our focus should be on the first, like 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. We use the categorical education qualification variables, and we see returns to vocational upper secondary education is about 24%. And obtaining academic, the baseline here is those who only complete compulsory education or below. So compared to those who only completed compulsory education or below, those who obtained academic upper secondary education gets about 20% more increase in their hourly wages, and those who completed vocational college gets about 50% more, and those who complete academic university gets about 75% more. Of course, so, a natural next step, since we mentioned in the second research question, is to do comparative analysis. The natural next step would be to compare the coefficients between these different qualifications. But some might already notice that these coefficients are not always directly comparable, because different qualifications may take different years to obtain. So in that case, it won't be fair to compare the different qualifications without taking into account their years. So we will address that in a minute. And before we get there, I just want to quickly mention this, this fact that we observe regarding the marital status. Basically, for men, it's marriage premium. So those men who get married obtain like more than 20% more earnings compared to those compared to single men. Whereas for female, the story is almost the opposite. So female who get married suffer from around 20% wage penalty. And this is pretty much in line with the literature, and I find this, so I thought it's interesting to mention. Now we come to the comparison of the different returns and also how we calculate them, how we do the conversions. So OLS estimates are first transformed via this Haberson method, which was also used by Pastore and the co-author. That is so because in the original regression we have semi-elasticity, namely we have the log hourly wages on the left-hand side, and then we have the linear form on the right-hand side. So this transformation will make the estimates more precise. And then for the yearly returns, after the transformation, we take the difference between the high level education qualification and returns to the high level education qualification and returns to the lower level qualification. Take the difference and divide the yearly differences. For example, if it takes 3 years to complete the upper secondary education. Then we divide this by 3. And correspondingly, the yearly differences are then calculated as the difference between the yearly returns, which was already calculated in this second part. And then we look at the other 2 estimating strategies, the IV method. The motivation is to account for potential indigeneity and to identify cultural relationship. And we identified 2 instruments. The first one was vocation. Actually, more specifically, it's vocational upper secondary enrollment ratio. And this was inspired by Dye and Martins. So one of 2 authors that was cited in our literature review, they used upper secondary enrollment ratio. So we went more in like a tiny step further and went more specific by calculating the vocational upper secondary enrollment ratio. And the second instrument was proportion of tertiary graduates nationwide. And this, I need to thank one of the GLO members who commented in my previous presentation and suggested I could try this. So I tried this as well. And so these 2 instruments both supposedly satisfy the relevance assumption because the instruments predict the likelihood of a student getting admitted to the next level education. But it's also kind of exclusive because it's not correlated to child ability, family group background, or other potential limiting factors. And we can have a look at the instruments. So here I plot the enrollment ratio. The blue line was our main focus. The blue line was the line that we took as the instrument. And that was calculated by the number of students who enter vocational upper secondary school divided by the number of students who graduate from lower secondary school. And then the second instrument was this proportion of university graduates relative to total population. And here we plot this over the years. And then we will see how well they perform in like 1 slide later. The other estimating strategy we use to identify cultural relationship was this Luber method. It was introduced by Luber and the co-authors in 2012, I believe. So we included the years in the paper, but yeah, I'll add this in the slides as well. The motivation for this Luber method was that the IV method can only produce local average treatment effects, but the Luber results can circumvent this restriction. It can also serve as robustness check to the IV results. This method, the logic was to use heteroscedasticity to identify models with endogenous regressors, circumventing the common challenges faced by IV method. And these 2 are mainly used to, help us do the comparative analysis. We see from the table here, we have 6 columns, and the first column OLS converted was OLS coefficients converted into yearly education after the transformation introduced by Harrelson. We see pretty interestingly, we always have positive coefficients, and the interpretation is that returns to vocational upper secondary education is higher than returns to academic upper secondary education. And secondly, returns to academic university education is higher than returns to vocational university education. And then lastly, returns to vocational university education is higher than returns to vocational upper secondary education. Like a tongue twister. I'm sorry, but that's just the terms that we have to use. Of course, if you can come with something similar, simpler, more intuitive, please feel free to let me know. I would really appreciate that. And then the second column was OLS coefficients without doing the yearly conversions, without just directly comparing the OLS coefficients across different education qualification categories. And I keep this OLS original OLS row so that we can compare these coefficients with the remaining 4 columns. So the IV1 and IV2 was when we use the 2 instrumental variables separately. and run the regression using education dummies. Now, because we always do a comparison between two categories, so we can stick with a dummy variable. And we see that the IV results are actually pretty pretty crazy, right? Not so reliable and doesn't tell us much. But one thing we see is, in the last row, this difference between vocational university education and and vocational upper secondary education is pretty robust and positive. Although the magnitude is not so reasonable, but the sign of the coefficients, I guess, is still robust. And if we look at the two Luber regressions, again, the first two rows are not really reliable, but if we look at the last row and we compare the Luber to coefficient 0.295 with the OLS coefficient 0.396, so the Luber coefficient is actually performing very well in the sense that the sign is robust, the magnitude of the coefficients is reasonable, and also we see the coefficient is slightly smaller than the OLS coefficients, which is what we expect to observe from an ideal, instrumental variable method. But if we are to summarize this table, the meaning of this table is more than what we can read from the coefficients. It also hopefully it can also inspire future researchers on the potential paths they can take in investigating similar topics or the potential problems they might want to avoid in this similar area. And then lastly, we will quickly go through some subsample analysis. The first subsample analysis was between male and female, and I present the graphs. I present the results graphically to make them more intuitive, hopefully, and more interesting. I personally feel. So this graph was comparing these returns to vocational upper secondary education between male and female, and from left to right, we have the years from 2010 to 2017. And interestingly, we see that at the vocational upper secondary level or category, females obtain more returns than males. But if we look at, this is academic upper secondary and this is vocational college, and then this is academic university, now it's like the situation is more favorable to males because the returns to males tend to be higher or at least not lower than female. And then we do subsample analysis across different sectors. And this I need to thank Odma, who made this comment in my previous presentation. And so we decided to try and have a look at the, different dynamics across different sectors. The first thing we can look at is the top left. We have 4 graphs corresponding to vocational upper secondary, academic upper secondary, vocational college, and academic university. If we look at the top left, we see that, if you are in the agricultural sector, what do you see? You don't really obtain any additional premium from getting a higher degree, right? It's almost like your return is not in the majority of the cases, not significantly different from zero. It's a sad story to learn, but yeah, that's what we observe. And then the second pattern we can look at is if we focus on these SOE, state-owned enterprises, and then the bottom left, privately owned enterprises. We see that at the vocational upper secondary level, the POE was not so significant, but the SOE is already significant, that the returns are significantly higher and different from 0. And if we scroll through the different education qualifications, it becomes pretty obvious that these education degrees are benefiting workers in those SOEs and POEs. And lastly, we can look at these FFE, foreign funded enterprises. This is actually a bit surprising, because we it's like we used to know that people who work in foreign funded enterprises are paid well, and foreign funded enterprises only recruit highly educated people. But if we look at the picture here, it's like over the years, returns workers in foreign funded enterprises are decreasing, and their returns are almost like in the agriculture sector, not so significantly different from 0. This is I don't know, but very interesting. Okay, maybe that can give you some food for thought. Thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.